mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Hear the good news. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. Does that sound like good news to you? In order to get at that, and I will just tell you in advance my bias, which is I love the Gospel of John, and this is one of my most favorite passages from the Gospel of John. So I will just tell you that in advance. In order to get at that, let's think about something that's very different and that has a very different message. I don't know if you recall, about 20 years ago, Bobby McFerrin released this song called "Don't Worry, Be Happy." The lyrics include these words: "Ain't got no place to lay your head. Somebody came and took your bed. Don't worry, be happy. Landlord say your rent is late. He may have to litigate. Don't worry, be happy." Though I like Mr. McFerrin's singing in general, I have to say this song will certainly go down in history for me as being just about my least favorite song in the world. It just has to do with the fact that there are a few enormous pieces of reality missing from the song. The most obvious one being that it seems that the song was written and sung by someone who had, in fact, did have an extremely comfortable bed to sleep on at night. More important for me, we live in a world where there are, in fact, many quite important things to worry about. Yet, as the years go by, it seems to me that more and more people have been following the theme of the song, giving their attention to increasing their own happiness. Do you think it's working? It's not working. It's not working to just not worry and be happy. We have a more or less constant reminder of this failure in our elected leaders. Now, I'm going to prepare you. This is going to be one of the most depressing things I have ever said while trying to preach the good news. Our elected leaders are, in fact, an accurate representation of the values of the American people. I'm sorry to say that, but I have to admit, I think it's true. Our increasingly furious pursuit of individual liberty and happiness are not working. There is evil in the world. It is true, worrying will not help. But it is also true that the pursuit of happiness is not going to address the problem of evil. The pursuit of individual liberties will not work. Just ask the parents of those kids from Newtown. Unregulated capitalism will not work. Just ask the oppressed religious minorities in China. There is evil in the world. It is important that we not exhaust ourselves by worrying about the troubles we face. We must find an effective way to respond to the evils and the troubles we face. And we must be confident that justice will be done. These four ideas are the main ideas of Jesus' final conversation with his disciples before his arrest and crucifixion. Chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16 of John address these four ideas: the evil we face, moving beyond worry, our response to evil, and the need for justice. Let's start with the evil in the world. This is the subject of the second half of chapter 15 and most of chapter 16. Here Jesus says, do not be surprised when you encounter evil and hatred. In chapter 16, he basically says, do not let the hatred you see be a stumbling block to you. Do not be fooled by the fact that some people who do very bad things seem to be extremely popular in the world. It's kind of a way of saying what he says in chapter 16. Jesus says, do not be discouraged when you see people using power for personal gain. Do not be surprised at the evil you see. In the end, justice will be done. Jesus' second idea is that we must move beyond worry. We should not waste our energy worrying about the evil we see. This is the theme of chapter 14. There Jesus says, do not let your hearts be troubled. I leave my peace with you. Trust in the strength of the peace I am giving you. I send my Spirit, the advocate, to sustain you. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let yourselves be afraid. The third idea is found in chapter 13. If we acknowledge that there is evil in the world, and if we understand that it will not help to worry, then we must have an effective way to respond to the troubles we face. Jesus' response to the evil of the world is love. In chapter 13, Jesus washes the disciples' feet. Then he asks them, do you know what I have done for you? I have served you. Just as I have served you, you also should serve one another. You should look out for the interests of others. This is called love. Jesus says, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. By this, not by anything else, will you be known as my disciples. So in chapter 13, we learn that love is our response to the evil of the world. You can tell that this idea must have come from God and not from us, not from me. Because most people think it is a terrible idea. Most people think that love is a weak response to the evils of the world, right? We only reveal our lack of connection to the one who made us when we fail to love. We only reveal our lack of understanding of the power of God's love when we fail to love. It is our work to love. Ultimately, it is God's work to bring justice to the world. This is the main idea of our gospel reading for today. Jesus says to his disciples, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Now, some people find these verses to be harsh. Jesus says, whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. I have heard 3 common concerns about these verses. The first one is, this does not sound much like love. One response to that concern would be, one of the parts of love is justice for those who have done terrible things to others. A second concern might be, I am afraid that I will end up being one of those branches that is cut off and burned. One response to that concern would be to say, this is one of those things where if you are worried, you don't have to be worried. If you are paying attention, I don't think you're going to be one of those branches that is cut off and thrown into the fire. Pretty sure about that. A third concern about all the pruning and burning might have to do mostly with impatience. I heard this from somebody in our church a few weeks ago. This person, upon hearing this verse, might say, "Yee-haw! But when is this justice going to be done? When do we get to see that lousy fellow thrown onto the brush pile and burned? I want a front row seat." And the response to that third concern might take us back to John 13. We aren't really in charge of the justice part of things. Our job is to love one another, especially to love the people who have been hurt. Don't be surprised or discouraged by the evil you see in the world. Try to not waste your energy worrying. Instead, devote yourself to love. It's work. Trust that God's will be done. Trust that God will bring justice for those who have been hurt and for those who have done the hurting. You might have noticed that in our reading from the first letter of John and from the Gospel of John, we had here this word, abide. Most people don't use it very often in everyday life, and it's not found very many places in the New Testament. The word abide summarizes all these things. Jesus says, "Abide in me as I abide in you. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit." To abide means to live. It is about a way of living. When we abide in the love of God, we remain in the love of God. This is not just rest, but action, abiding in love. Abide in the love of God. This means not ignorance of the evil of the world. On the contrary, the love of God is most concerned about evil, about justice. Hear these words from the first letter of John. God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. So, set aside your worries. Trust in God's justice. Act in the spirit of God's love. Abide in the love of God.